Welcome to HEMA Hot Takes, where people argue about things. Yay. I'm giving the highest quality professional introduction of this. Francois had something he wanted to argue about, and I'm just going to open the floor to him when he's going to come out and say something that's totally opinionated, we hope. Otherwise, he's going to go, wait a minute, I haven't woken up yet. Someone else throw it in.
Right. You want me to just begin like this?
Yes, go for it. This is informal because this is HEMA Hot Takes, not HEMA Prepared Takes.
All right, then. HEMA saber design is wrong inherently. And I can prove it mathematically. No, but I will show it to you with a few antique examples of historical sabers and what makes them feel how they do, how they're designed, and what characteristics make them wieldable. Whereas HEMA sabers trying to replicate the profile of these historical sabers do not achieve this. Right. So to diagnose a problem, what we need to see as I don't have any examples on hand right now because I got rid of mine. My HEMA sabers are trying to replicate antiques, but what they tend to feel like is they're very heavy and sluggish in the cut. They do not flex very well sometimes. And the guards are trying to essentially are made to look like real sabers, and that's a problem for your fencing practice, as far as I'm concerned. Right. So diagnosing the problem. Let's grab here this Napoleonic on like cavalry saber. One of the features of this is the blade is mostly the same shape in the profile. Fine enough. Normally, that's a very broad-bladed saber like this. Looks very cool, looks very nice. And it still feels very wieldable. Easy to swing around, go around, thrust with it. You can do lots of cool cut and point work and redirect your fencing actions very easily with this. But here's the thing. The reason why this happens is if you look here, these are insanely thick at the spine and very, very thin at the cutting portion. All your mass distribution that in other swords, especially the earlier medieval swords, would be done by having the profile get thinner here, whereas this would be a lot thinner, is done along the spine. And that's because these sabers were being made historically by swordsmiths that were forging blades, especially for the French ones, industrially to supply an army. We don't have this anymore. I have another example here. Same thing for this Napoleonic infantry saber. This is the chasseur à pied saber for the French, from French. Same thing here. Very thin at the foible, very thick at the back. What this does in terms of mass distribution is that most of your mass in your blade is going to be centered around the center of gravity here, between the hilt and the blade mass. And that's what's going to create your lively feeling sword. It's going to want to move around with you very well. What HEMA sabers are not able to do, though, because we need to have thicker edges to practice, we have a fairly thin blade here, and it gets a bit thinner, but it's still fairly thin. If you don't have that way to distribute the mass with your distal taper along the spine, you will need to compensate somehow, and you will have to sacrifice the profile of these saber blades, these cool wide profiles that make them look like real sabers, so that your saber can balance properly and still have all that mass near your center of gravity, so that it doesn't feel like this one here, where these two look very similar, but they are very different swords, because this one has some profile taper and some distal taper, which is very important. This one has no distal taper and a bit less profile taper than this one. And this feels sluggish. It feels like I'm moving all the mass over here. Whereas this feels like I'm moving all the mass that's over here, like these historical examples. The feel of what your saber that you use for HEMA should be feeling like this. Like you've got all the mass that you're moving is moving here, not here. because that's what these historical examples are like. And no matter what you do, you cannot really recreate a historical sword in terms of its looks and profile to really be able to create a fensible weapon. You can certainly recreate a sword that will look like it, but you will not have a quality fencing tool. So if my HEMA hot take for today is that HEMA sabers are wrong, and you should be using fencing sabers designed expressly for the purpose of fencing, that have these blades that are tapering a lot along the profile plane, because you cannot, with blades that are being cut out from sheet metal today, from sheet steel, get this thick spine, because these come about as thick as this. Want a comparison? This is twice as thick, easily, at the spine. So because of the modern manufacturing principle that we need for HEMA sabers to make them cheap and accessible enough for us to use, we have to start changing the looks of our sabers and not try to just blindly recreate what the historical example looks like, because it's not going to end up feeling like the historical example, which is the important part for your system, not what it looks like. All right.
All right.
That's my rant over.
I'm going to jump in and continue your rant, because I agree and disagree with you and have spent literal decades discussing this with people. First off, I know you're a modernist for the most part. I can confirm to you that medieval weapons also have significant distal taper issues, and it's not just about the center of balance. Where that mass goes and how those curves move affect the handling dramatically, to the point where I took a belt sander, actually it was an orbital sander, I lie, to a couple of wooden wasters to a seminar a few years back, and stood in the room going, here's a Purple Heart waster. It's a perfectly good waster. Here's a Purple Heart waster with distal taper. Now tell me which of these two lets you swing it like a sword and cut, and which one of you people are going to be unsafe with, because all that extra mass at the tip tells you that you have to handle it like a club. To the point where Christian Darcy actually made tapered longsword wasters an option for club use. He actually put it on the site after people looked at it and started bugging him saying, hey, I want the tapered ones. We also have edge taper, and that's also a really big deal for handling. So I worked with Angus Trim for a number of years, and one of the things I drove him batshit crazy about was I've handled a number of original 14th century longswords. None of the replicas felt anything like it. For starters, the replicas were way too floppy. And for a very long time, Gus would say it's not possible to have the incredibly rigid blades you're talking about in this distal and profile taper sword profile. Well, eventually he figured out that, oh, if you look at the edge taper, it becomes possible. We want the exact opposite. We don't want that rigidity. We want the flexion. People have argued for years we can't possibly fence safely if we're hitting people with a really narrow edge. Well, you're hitting with either momentum and kinetic energy as your primary thing. If you reduce the amount of mass out there at the tip, you hit with less momentum. You're still hitting quickly, but you don't penetrate as much. To steal from one of my old academic papers, kinetic energy is what shatters your jaw. Momentum is what knocks you off the bar stool. If you're wearing padding, a low momentum weapon doesn't penetrate the padding. If you're wearing padding, a high momentum weapon goes right through it, which is why, for example, yours truly gets cracked ribs. I've gotten a cracked rib through a longsword jacket before, because I got nailed by one of these sabers with no distal taper whatsoever. And it was just a case of two bodies came together, smash. That same blow with a more tapered saber would not have penetrated the jacket. So agreeing and disagreeing, who wants in?
Me. Like to recontextualize this within fencing is that I see two extremes being created, some artificially and some not. In the case of Okay, so we are aware of shortcomings of trying to replicate service swords, basically, as one-to-one ideals for fencing. As Francois points out, this is difficult to perform on one hand, and secondly, it's not even really necessary because the handling is an important bit. My question is though the following, because the more people I've talked about this, I've seen a trend towards lighter sabers. So you have more mass in the hilt, you have a lighter blade, but what that kind of creates is also if you look at, for example, later Italian and Raelian sabers for fencing that are like 400, 500, or even less grams, is they allow you to create, to basically do actions that would be difficult to do with a service sword. So in the terms of handling, they're different, that you can, sure, because they're light, you can fence for longer. This is a good thing, but stuff like, I don't know, doing like 2 or 3 or 4 feints in a row, which I mean, I've recently acquired a 1.2 kilogram French cavalry saber. I can't really do that with it. I can do it with a sports saber. So the question is, should we try to replicate the handling as much as possible, or to make it easier to do complex actions that I would never really think of doing if I were using a service sword?
I think that's going to depend on the game you want to play.
Hmm.
I think the first consideration should be, and I think a lot of people don't realize this because they think, oh, I'm going to use the sword because I want to use the sword. Well, it's also your first part of PPE, right? Like, regardless of what you're wearing or who your partners are, your first piece of PPE is the weapon you're using. And in this case, it would be a weapon you're using against your partner. So I would say, as long as it can be made safely and it's not a 25 kilogram or 25 pound, for those imperial people out there, flex, right? Then sure, recreate your service saber or whatever. But I think fundamentally, it's going to come down to what kind of game you want to play, what kind of system you want to be working with. Like, for example, if you take Del Frate, he'll say, look, you know, and for all those people out there who say that it's a dueling saber system, it's not. It's absolutely not. It's a military saber system. Del Frate literally says in his book, though, that you can do his system with a lightsaber, but you can also do it with a cavalry weighted weapon. Granted, cavalry weight is a huge span, right?
I can confirm that.
Yeah, right. And so you can do things with a 650 gram weapon, which again, the weight isn't, as we've just demonstrated, the be all end all, right? But you can do some things differently that'll affect the fencing, but it won't change the system. Am I going to feint with something that's way, way heavier? And probably not. But I guess what I'm trying to say is, it depending on the system, the saber you're using may not change the whole game dramatically.
I think I can disagree with this one, to be honest. I'm looking, for example, at several German sources, and there are clearly some dueling sources, for example. And if you would fight it with a huge blade, like a Palash or something like this, or 1.1 kilogram, the basics you can do, yes, of course, because it's a cut, but the juicy stuff like feints or something like this and movements, no, you cannot do this. For example, academic fencing or earlier dueling fencing, you have several movements where you need a lighter blade, even with the saber. And therefore, it really depends which system you're fighting with. You say, okay, I'm going to do military fencing. I take a military saber. They can be a little bit heavier. But let's say if you're doing something like a dueling or an early sports fencing, you need a lighter saber. For example, okay, I take this one, let's say Barbazetti. You cannot fight Barbazetti with 1100 grams heavy saber, for example, or straight sword, something like this. I think this is not possible.
That would be where I would actually disagree, and I would want to see this happen, because right, Barbazetti is not fundamentally different than Del Frate, and he would be using heavier, like they used heavy cavalry weighted swords in that Italian system. It's a cavalry system. They also use lighter stuff. The Italians loved killing each other with all manner of things, right? Is it going to be different? Yes. I will totally agree with you. It's going to change the game a little bit. Am I going to do 3 or 4 feints like Georgia was saying? Absolutely not. But do I have to go outside the system to fence with something heavier? I would say no. But I can only speak to Del Frate Barbacetti kind of rat alien. I can't really expand that to other systems because I, quite frankly, don't know anything about them.
I want to say something about it. So recently I got a Maya Rapier, so basically a side sword, and I thought like, hey, let's just fence saber with this. And the interesting thing is what then happened was that it was absolutely not possible. I just the movements, the typical saber back and forth, it just didn't really happen. I basically had to go and fence close-eyed for the most part, basically like anticipating where I have to be because it was a really slow beastmare, so to speak. It was really, it's not even about doing 1 or 2 feints. It's really, I really had to change my approach to fencing with such a kind of sword. Even though I thought it's just a one-handed cut and thrust sword, what's the big difference? Can't be that different, right? But it makes really an impact, I would say.
I think that's just a big thing, right? It's just like, as Francois pointed out earlier, right? There's so many characteristics to how a sword feels that just looking at weight and everything, it's so hard to convey that over over a picture or spec sheet or anything like that.
I can give a very fast example of that that's not French before Francois jumps in with his giant weapons rack. In the other room, I've got an M1904. It weighs 1,300 grams. I've also got I haven't perfectly identified it, but it's an early to mid spear-pointed Blücher. The M1904 is significantly faster in the hand, even though the weight profile puts it at a place where most people would want nothing whatsoever to do with it. It's out in atrocious land. Even most of the gruggers in HEMA Sabre land would look at this thing and go, oh no, fuck that noise. It's not happening because it's so ridiculously heavy. But the weight distribution makes it lively in the hand, even though the point of balance is, get this, 18 centimeters forward. That edge still wants to hop in your hand. It wants to jump around and it wants to cut. We have nothing simulating these kinds of weapons. And most of our fencing sabers, as well as our HEMA sabers, you can really tell the difference between the different cultures' ideas of what the sabers were supposed to do. Because when I look at original Hungarian and Polish sabers, they all have that characteristic of liveliness where the tip wants to do this. And it takes very little effort to do that. With a Blücher, you're working a lot harder. With some of the French sabers, it also wants to do this, in spite of the fact that they tragically don't really bother with false edges. With other of the French sabers, it feels like I'm trying to do wrist moulinet with a Cadillac fender, even though I can turn the point on half of a dime rather than just a dime. Okay, Francois, hit me.
And that's kind of where I was going with my point of it's very much about not so much your point of center of balance of to where your mass is and is it around your center of gravity, because at that point that's going to matter a lot more for getting that lively tip that's a very agile feeling saber than anything. What I find and what I very much dislike about this thing that has, I think, 0.5 centimeter of distal taper is that the center of gravity is about here, but when you swing it, it feels like everything I'm swinging is up here. And so what that means is that that's the kind of saber that I would say I agree with Georgia. Like I can't go do 3-4 feints with this. It's too slow. It's it just doesn't. It's not like it doesn't want to move. It's the kind of saber where I'm gonna go full send with a cut, and then be like, oh shoot, if it misses, I can't really pull it back with myself. Whereas this, which is a Hanwe Pekohajo and Castile blade, looks on the surface very similar to this, but this distal taper and a little extra bit of profile taper there, all these elements play into all these elements that bring all the mass near the center of gravity, and that make it a very lively feeling saber where I can actually, like, it does this as Russ was mentioning, whereas this doesn't. This is what makes it a fensible weapon and something that I can use no matter what the weight of it is like. This thing is 900 grams or so, 900, 950, somewhere between. And yet it still also does this because most of the mass is around the center of gravity, just like this fencing saber over there. And I think that for me, especially for my French systems, that's a lot more important than the actual specific weight of the saber. If we're talking about this an S2000, a sports saber, yes, that's going to change the game a lot. But I don't think that that's what I'm talking about here right now. I'm talking about specifically sabers that are being used for HEMA, trying to replicate under some form historical sabers or not. And I think that the common approach to look at this, all right, let's cut out a blade that looks like this, mount it on a hilt that looks like this, and be done with it. That's doing a disservice to us all. And I'm sorry, I got really worked up over it like earlier because it's a point that annoys me to no end, and it's a myth I find that will not die, and I hate it.
Can I jump in real quick and be
yes.
an interrupting asshole on the three of you who are actually polite and raised your hands? Because this hits a neuralgic point for me, and I know you guys like to hear me rant, and it therefore might be worthwhile. Thank you for your patience. The other side of that coin is, like, I went to visit Chaba, and he still uses old antique sabers for fencing. And people are going, gasp, horror, but they're safer. They're much safer. And on that lines, if we look at somebody who has never had a chance to handle the originals and call them out as terrible gruggers, then we're kind of the ones being the assholes, because they've only had a training tool which tells them, in order to move this tip, I must put all of this force into the cut. Of course, they don't want to look at the more sophisticated fencing because their tool is saying, there's no way you can make that practical. So they tend to stick with extremely simple fencing because their tool tells them, swing it like a club, don't cut. And then you get into things where, oh, tatami cutting, it's such a mystery, it's an art, you have to study it separately. No, you don't. Get an actual real service saber, sharpen it up, and go to town on your rose bushes, and you will be very good at cutting in very short order. Okay, rant over. I'm very sorry. Georgia, thank you for being patient.
That was really informative, and I would have hated to have robbed the viewers of listening to that. And
I was going to finish up on a thing.
Oh, right, Francois, continue.
Sorry. One of the things I wanted to hammer home while I'm still here is that I hear a lot of people often also talking about how there's this distinction between cavalry and infantry sabers, and as far as I'm concerned, short of length, that's a distinction that I think is not a very useful one to talk about sabers and whatnot. Let me pull out an example. This one here, which is essentially the same as this Onef light calf saber, except this is a example manufactured in the 1840s for somebody who wants to, during the 1848 revolutions, to be more in favor with the Second Empire. This is essentially the same thing cut down to infantry length as this one. Yet they feel remarkably similar. This one's a bit heavier in the blade and whatnot, but grossly they're very similar. Same thing, I want to talk about this 1882 infantry saber for the French. And in the back here, I have another one. That's a cavalry saber. It is a model 1883 light cavalry saber with an unusual hilt. But these are more or less the same. This is the infantry, this is the cavalry. They are different shaped blades, but in terms of length, in terms of weight distribution, in terms of mass, they are the exact same. If you handed me both of these, they have the same backstrap, same handle too. If you handed me both of these and did not tell me which one is which, blindfolded, I could not tell them apart just by swinging them. It's one of the things that annoys me about also distinguishing between infantry and cavalry sabers, because that distinction is not always useful. You have some very, very light. I have an example over there that I can't go pull out yet, but it's 750 grams. I have infantry sabers that weigh more. That's I think we need to start talking about sabers in terms of how much they endorse their handling characteristics, and less is it like is it a saber that's been built, or a model that's been ordered for people who are in infantry or people who are in the cavalry. Because while there are some emerging patterns, I think that's an emerging pattern out of a field that's this wide. Whereas, like, if we had a line on a graph, our line would be this wide. Whereas I think if we wanted to talk about this and tell, we talk about it as if the line was this large along your graph. There you go. Sorry, have at it.
Right. No, that was definitely an interesting point. The only thing that I would interject in that regard is that it is a bit subjective handling, because it's hard to quantify. Like, I don't have a system international unit of measurement for handling. That's like the big problem. But ideally, it is what you're saying. However, the reason I raised my hand initially was because Russ mentioned we make fun of gruggers this is for, oh, you hit too hard and you've never been exposed to, original sabers. And I've actually noticed an interesting trend recently. The last time we actually had newcomers, like en masse, coming into our class, me and my co-instructor actually managed to get a few antique sabers. So anything from dragoon cavalry sabers to some polishers rather, or some infantry sabers, so on. So we got 3 or 4, not much. We are not as lucky as Francois, but a few, so the newcomers can get a sense for it. And what I discovered is that they like the handling, the feeling of them, and they tend to gravitate towards fencing sabers that replicate that. And so that's the moment where I come in, being the annoying person that I am, and I pull out the old reliable. So this boy, this is 850 grams of righteousness and 530 grams of blade. And the thing is, it tapers from about 4 to 2 millimeters, which in terms of antique sabers is nothing. This is a sparring saber. It bends somewhat, but you cannot recover by doing a hit and pulling back. You always have to recover via moulinet. And I personally find it incredibly unwieldy, even though I've had it for more than half a year. And I've just been like, oh, you like sparring with my lighter, more, easier to handle sabers? Try this. And it completely shatters the image of, oh, a saber needs to look like the service sword. So, because that in and of itself is a nasty compromise, because I would, if we did, for example, I don't know, Napoleonic reenactment, I would very much want my saber to look like that. I want, if I'm portraying a certain unit, but I'm not. I'm a guy in a fencing jacket trying to get points. And for me, I'd want something where, I can feasibly do the stuff in my system. But however, there's always the thing of where do you draw the line? So we're back to quantifying again. And how do you tell, makers that you actually want this? Because they will give you stats that are mildly useless. They will give you things like length, weight, And if you're lucky, flex. Flex is a useful stat though, but otherwise eventually blade width. And stuff like tapers or weight distribution, no. So rant over.
Corey, you were next.
So they an interesting sort of anecdote. They were making these service sabers right on an industrial level. They had abilities to make this stuff at scale that we aren't doing today, because as much as we love HEMA and we love ourselves, we're not that big of a market, right? So usually it devolves into a million monkeys grinding on steel until we reach some sort of blade, right? An interesting thing that Sebastian Sager did, and I love him for this, he went and found a actual, Radaelian fencing saber, like an antique, and basically worked with a Fabre armorum, which I think it was such a pain in the ass they won't make these anymore. But he actually got them to make the like as close as possible in terms of distal taper and blade design, the actual fencing blade. And it looked almost identical, and Russ actually handled them, so he can sort of back me up here. They looked almost identical to Castile's. And it was like the equivalent of driving a dump truck or driving a Ferrari. It was an incredible difference in how it handled. And it was a joy, a true joy. They weren't as durable as the Castile stuff, but it was just absolutely fantastic. And this is because, I think a lot of people will shit on antique fencing sabers, which fine, whatever, but in some cases they were made and handled better than our current blades, simply because we don't have the money market size to make these en masse anymore.
And the Castiles are no slouches when compared to
No.
much of the rest of the market. It's the difference is insane. When I visit Chris Holtzman up in Wichita, and we sometimes just sort of walk through his room full of antique sabers. Oh man, I wish I could just bring Chris and his room of antique sabers to any seminar so they could see the difference. And of course, the question then is, going back to what you're talking about, Corey, is how the hell do you make that affordable so a manufacturer can stay in business?
The answer is you either grow HEMA to the point that they can start doing this again, or you start fencing with antique sabers, which
Parentheses real quick. While I have it, while we're on this right now, I want to show this antique fencing saber. This is a Barbasetti model, old one. And you can see the same pattern you see in service sabers here, where you've got a very thick spine, like fairly thick spine. It doesn't look that much here, but once I pull this down to near the tip, this is 0.5 millimeter. I measured it with I think this is like actually not 0.5 millimeter. That's a bit dramatic, but I think close to 3/4 of a millimeter ish. Like versus this, which is 4 or 5. That's the same sort of weight distribution along the distal plane that you see in other service sabers that are meant for cutting.
Yeah,
They've
in
got
19th century army guys beat the shit out of each other with these things. So they didn't just explode on contact. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was done. I was just making parentheses to show these fencing sabers in terms of their distal design, the design on the distal plane, are designed the same way as these antique service sabers. So why are we not doing that today?
Because it's a pain in the ass if you're just grinding. I mean, honestly, like Fabre did it, and they won't do it anymore because it's such a pain in the ass, because they're not just making these on industrial scale. So it's literally like, if you've ever seen it, Darkwood, Castile, all these people, they're literally sitting there with water-cooled grinders and grinding steel out, as opposed to, quite frankly, I don't know how they did it, but it was not an industrial scale to cost money. So the answer, I mean, yeah, we're not doing it because it would cost too much money.
I can second that, since I work closely or have been friends with a sword maker for years and years and years. You order a billet of steel, and the thickness of the steel you order directly translates into how much you have to charge, and it makes a dramatic difference. So taking something that's a 1/2 inch thick and removing 3/4 of it during the grinding process is a local environmental problem, because if you don't have the right setup, you're coating your walls with metal dust. You can kill yourself with this shit because of the lung and breathing issues. B, an insane amount of time, and C, you're taking most of what you've paid for and thrown it out the door. So what they have to charge for that is going to be absolutely through the roof.
But it's worth noting, when you get it right, you get this beautifully handling blades that flex in the last third. Like it's all of that stuff that you're like, oh, this is what I want. This is why. This is what you get. And yeah, you just either have to find someone crazy enough to do the grinding for you, or we have to find make HEMA big enough.
These used to be forged.
Yeah, they would just be poured, right? Like just
No, forged.
Oh, okay.
So somebody would be making these by hand at a forge and whatnot, because they had the forges to make like the service sabers and whatnot. So the rest of the time they could make fencing sabers like this all the time because they had that industrial capacity, whereas we don't.
I remember Sebastian was saying that at some point they actually were able to stamp them like en masse, some of this stuff. I wish.
That's my parentheses over for my saber sorcerer.
Okay, so basically I wanted to get to the same point we already talked about, but I have the fabled Fabri Amorum saber here, which we just talked about. And it's not exactly the same with the huge guard, but I'm very lucky that I still got that. And I wanted to show you the strong and the weak. So it's a relatively thin saber, but it starts although really thick over here and goes all the way down to like basically almost 1 millimeter thin at the tip. I can really attest these are amazing. It's amazing saber.
Can you
My
show
shipping
them?
addresses.
Yeah, can you show them like at the very end? You see there's this fuller that runs, and then the fuller will stop, and the actual end of the sword, yeah, it actually almost changes cross section. You see this raised ridge. It's hard to see on Marcus's video, but there's a raised ridge and it actually changes the cross section a little bit to be a little more of a diamond shape. But that tip, that last 3 to 4 inches, it bends beautifully, and it doesn't like flop. It's not, but yeah, I'm telling you, it's one of the best blades I've ever handled.
Yeah, but it's just a question. I don't think anyone is arguing that distal taper is bad or is shit. It's just a question: how can we get to that point that we get a maker who can get this stuff out in en masse? That's just I think that's what it all boils down to.
Georg, I think you were next.
Yeah. I just think, well, it's a little bit of a heretic point of view. If you really want to standardize, maybe we should go back a little bit. For example, I can tell that the academic saber that Francois owns, can you show it one more time, please?
Yes, I just gotta pull it out now. It's buried under a pile of sabers that I've been using for demonstrative purposes.
Yeah.
This whole hot take is just basically Francois showing off his giant shitload of swords. That's all.
So
That's
as you
it.
would
For the
Call
viewers,
them
this has
out.
become a bit of an inside joke now between this group. Whereas whenever somebody starts to talk about a specific kind of saber, I'm like, oh, I have one of
This
those.
one.
yeah, the running joke is that's Francois has displayed. So
I,
basically, but yeah.
I don't have that many sabers. It doesn't look like it.
Uh-huh.
But
That's what she said, right?
It's just a hologram in the background. It's just 3 sabers.
But just
yes.
but just for an example, this kind of saber is still produced today and also used in some areas of Germany as well for just practicing it due to tradition. So my hot take on saber protection would be that we say, okay, we just take this one and let's say for the makers say, okay, do this one or go away, basically. But okay, yeah, but then we are also back again in this where we can say, yeah, what can you do? Because context matters. If you're fighting military system, you can do it with a sports saber, but with a heavy saber, you cannot fight a sport or dueling system because then a lighter saber is needed. So, but my hot take would be that we basically go and tell the makers to do something like this. Which is still active and still is produced, but it's a very niche, and you cannot get it outside of Europe. Basically, this is a pity. Basically,
Georgia?
Oh, yeah. So yeah, Marcus and I had the lovely pleasure of meeting at Sabre Slash at the start of October, and I had the wonderful chance to fence with these Fabrica and Modern sabers, as well as the ones provided by Swordsmithy. Swordsmithy being company, I believe, led by Mikhail Knashko, who also organizes Sabre Slash, and for those in the classical saber fencing community, definitely rings a bell. And they're trying to replicate Barbasetti style sabers that are, I think, a bit below 600 grams, and they are, they're very nimble, they're very flexible, they have like that same hilt, they have a lovely back strap, lovely handle for those that really love Radelian school fencing. It's really ideal. I wasn't really that convinced of it because first of all, the maintenance on those things. First thing, price. I asked him as well also how much this one cost. And he was like between 300 and 400 euros, and it takes me a while to get one done. So it's like, that's already margins more than me going to like a Krieger and saying, I want a saber for 200 bucks. Here you go, hit people with it. And secondly, maintenance. Because first off, we did a whole tournament with them, which all of the blades survived, even though we were not as kind to them as we should have been. And the thing is, however, you thrust somebody and the blade bends. You can't straighten it out by hand. Otherwise, there's a high risk of snapping, says Michael. So what you do is you lay it down on a flat surface and hammer it into shape. So every 2-3 bouts, somebody raises their hand, gets the saber taken out of their hand, and just click, 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 next one. And second thing is, because they have a large amount of distal taper. I didn't have the chance to measure them, but he says that if the foible gets to a certain degree where it's like all like a saw, like a bit jagged and the like, you actually have to get that sorted now, because the edge is so thick, it has a higher chance of cutting than, let's say, I don't know, your average insert HEMA saber here. And so that's like a big thing on maintenance and expenses. However, that's not my main thing. I genuinely didn't like the handling of a lighter saber. I like the idea of having a certain amount of commitment to an action that also doesn't disallow me from beforehand planning, okay, first, second, third intention, and so on and so forth, if necessary. And so for me, it's like, I had the opportunity to read Sebastian Seeger's article on Austro-Hungarian sabers, fencing sabers from like the 1890s to 1880s that would like push like 700, 800 grams. And Arlo, in his like pre-Radelian book that he wrote with Litomitsky on the high tier system, he says, okay, start initially with 16 millimeter blades, the same ones you have, like, I mean, not the same, but similar enough to the ones you have on Class T. And then if your students are, I don't know, like feel ready enough for it, you can also start with heavier sabers. But he also warns specifically against service sword sabers, where he says those that teach students with this are buffoons. He doesn't like them a lot. He says you'll tire them out and they'll have sloppy technique. So for me, I would like to find that holy grail middle ground somewhere. Remains to be seen. I really like the Krieger saber I have, which is like 740 grams. It still has some issues, like almost to not zero distal taper, but it has a significant amount of flex. It feels easy to handle, but who knows? Right, that was rant over.
All right. I have a hot take. No one's going to like it. Are you ready?
No.
We
Yes.
know what the mass distribution is. In many cases, we know what the taper is down to fine details. We even have service sword or pre-service sword measurements from guys like Zabwatski that give us very fine details. So metal's really expensive. Why don't we recreate those profiles in synthetic? We know they will be wider and have more air resistance because the material is lighter, but we could in fact take those proportions and exactly mimic those proportions in either wood or synthetic material. And before you guys freak out, the reason I started with the longsword wasters like that was I had a pair from a boat builder and they did flex, especially when properly oiled. They flexed really, really well and they survived really well. I got a chip out of one of them when we were explicitly abusing it. But why not work with that as a basic training material for people who can't possibly afford a $400 saber? By the way, that's my entire school. I provide the gear for my school. I can't afford a $400 saber. What's wrong with going that way? So at least people are handling something that has the proper handling characteristics. And then when you go to a tournament, you use whatever you've got available.
So
I like that.
yeah.
Sorry.
So I already thought about to say something similar because we can shape and form synthetics very, very easily. You can just go to Black Fence and tell them, okay, can I have this? And they just make it. So this might be, maybe someone, maybe even me, I could maybe try ask them if they want to make it, but I don't know. Have to see.
I've never handled their goods, but if you've got the connection, go for it.
Yeah, I have one of their Black Fencer, what was it? The infantry sabers. They have like the tiniest amount of, that one, the tiniest amount of distal taper. Just like it, I think it's like 1 millimeter. It goes like 1 or 2 millimeter flatter towards the end. But I wondered, not only in steel and synthetic, but if we could do more with profile taper, which is basically the solution that Krieger made, and which is the reason why their handling is actually okay. Maybe let me just grab it.
I like the noises in the background. That's funny.
Rattle saber.
Saber rattling. So this is the Krieger saber, and as you can see, it has basically no distal taper. I think it is like 0.5 millimeter of distal taper, but the profile goes rather extreme, and I think this is the reason they actually handle pretty decently. I think they could handle a little bit better, but they're actually pretty decent. And I wonder, maybe we can go with the profile even thicker on the base and make it a little bit more extreme. I wonder if this maybe could be even better. But yeah, I don't know. What do you think? Next one.
I think that that's pretty much the ideal solution, honestly, for the manufacturing techniques we have available, because at that point you can cut out a blade out of sheet stock, sheet metal, and at that point you don't have to get all that distal taper going in. The offhand though, which is what I was saying, like maybe we shouldn't be trying to replicate the look of these historical sabers, is because inherently, if we want to do that with our manufacturing techniques, we will produce something that's not fencible. So to create something that's fencible, we will have to sacrifice the look of these cool antiques, and they look cool, they look awesome. But if they create a terrible fencing tool, then what's the point? At that point, you're not really representing your system quite as well as you would like to either. So I think that going hard on the profile taper for us is going to be a necessity for a while. Sacrificing pretty much the profile of our looks. Our blades may not look like the real thing, but if they at least feel like it, then I think that's a win. Sorry, go ahead. Whoever.
I believe it was Georg.
Yeah.
Okay, then I take it. I'm in the I'm at Rust side, so I say also let's say let's do it with the synthetics for training, because the synthetics are good. I'm in my club we fence with Black Fencer sabers. I also got the synthetics from Black Fencer, and they are very, very good for handling. Basically, I really like them, and I am a full in Rust. If you join a club or make a new or something like this, buy the synthetics because it's realistically and not everybody else. And also, if you have a small club and are on a tight budget, you cannot simply afford a €400 or $400 saber. It's really, really good to use the synthetics, and you can shape the plastic material basically like you want it. So you really can say, okay, this is the right from the original, from the antique, and then you can shape it accordingly.
Yeah, you can take a synthetic and take your orbital sander to it and just go whoop until it handles the way you want it to.
Or this is also possible.
Georgia? Oh, go ahead.
Because before we move on from this, one of the things that I want to say for club loaners in terms of having synthetic, I think that's very good for club loaners. You would have lost me if you said as your personal fencing weapon, for your personal training tool for all the time. There you would have lost me, because at that point, how synthetics feel with point work, which is very important for my system, I would have said no, that's not good enough. I would rather use a modern fencing saber to do that. But in terms of club loaners, especially for systems that don't put so much emphasis on the point as mine, that's awesome. That's my little thing I wanted to say before the topic gets buried.
All right. So I am running out of time. So Georgia, can you give us something exciting and flamboyant?
Yes, I'm gonna be a hypocrite and go back on a thing I said like an hour ago, which is that if we're talking about loaner gear for beginners, if the main thing is accessibility, because I can't have newcomers coming in and telling them, well, you need to dump X money into this until we have what we want. So synthetics do not fill this gap for me personally, because I can generate a similar amount of force that is directed on a slightly wider blade, but it still hurts. And some synthetics, like I have a few synthetics on Black Fencer, and they're either very flexible and it works, or they are so stiff that I can prop myself up on them and they won't sink a bit. And so, because for beginners, I think having a longer lesson is better, so they can fence for longer without getting tired. They have less equipment, and they need something that's easy to handle. This is a foam saber. It costs $40. I have fencers that have done 4, 5, 6 months with this, and they're transitioning to steel now as they gather gear. They have no problem going into second because they've done it for hours with a lighter weapon. But hey, you don't go to the gym and bench press 150 kilos. You go and you bench 10, 20, X amount of reps, and then you slowly build up to it. Foams are nice. I prefer them to synthetics for this particular reason. And yes, they bend somewhat less, but you have enough padding at the tip that you really have to. I don't know, I've thrust people from a balestra lunge, and they've just been like, "Oh, I've been hit," but nobody exploded. So far, so good. And yeah, my flamboyant hot take is we'll never agree, but we kind of have to break away with the old spirit of HEMA. That's we can't agree on a standard, and everybody does their own thing, because that leads to us not being able to gather around a specific model we want, which we can then go to makers and say, we want this, make this. And that's why a change like this will be gradual and painful if we don't find a way of at least unionizing in some way. If not by leagues, then by some sort of organ that says PPE has to be like this. And by PPE, as Corey said, who is now sadly not here, is also swords. So yeah, mild take done.
Yep. And you read in the back of my book, I shoot my mouth off about that. Synthetics good, waster's good, foam good, steel good. I think it's a really good point. And we do need to come up with something, because otherwise the manufacturers are catering to teeny tiny niches which won't buy from them otherwise. So maybe the next really vicious argument, and we'll get ESO to actually like yell at us a little bit as opposed to lurking here staring at me, is what standards should we advocate and why? That sounds
Yes,
like
that's
a
a-
terrible topic.
That's the spicy stuff, because everyone's doing a different system. Mine has fairly light and not very bendy sabers. So I need a really different weapon than whatever they're doing in Poland, because a clubmate trained there and he has a saber from there, and it's just super forward weighted and it works perfectly fine for the system they're using there, but not really that much for Feldman. So how do we get to a weapon that works for all of us? I don't think we can, really.
All right. Does that sound like a happy argument for y'all for next time, or should we come up with a different thing?
Yeah, it
Sounds
good.
perfect.
Sounds perfect. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, folks, and we will catch you next time.
Yes.
Sorry
See
for
ya.
getting so worked
See
up.
ya.
I had
Later,
things to
guys.
say and things that had been annoying me for, I think, 2.5 years now.
Oh, and I'm sorry for interrupting you, but I'll die on that hill, beating up on a beginning fencer for not knowing the difference when they've never handled an original is just abuse.
Yeah, and I agree with that. I agree with you on that count. Which I think is exposure to antique originals is one of the things that would serve to do that, but that's very complicated to do.
I know a
So-
manufacturer who makes a very affordable beater blade. I will talk to him about this problem and see what he says for next time.
All right.
What, you mean I can't shame people in my club into knowing more? Like, HEMA is over.
My students would say I probably do that, but no, I never shame or yell at anyone. See y'all
Right.
later.
Bye.
See
bye.
ya.
See you later.
guys.
See
Bye.
ya.
Bye.
We've got more videos and content coming, so if you liked what you saw and it was useful for you, please stab the like button, /subscribe, and punch the little bell icon so that you're notified immediately when new content comes available. Thanks, and go do the thing.